Greetings to everyone. Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome to this special webinar put together by Chatham House entitled The Iraq War in Living Memory. Such a great title, and we hope it will be a very interesting and indeed very urgent and timely discussion over the next 60 to 75 minutes. That depends on all of you who are joining us, how great your questions are and how much you would like this conversation to go on for. So to begin, once upon a time, the Iraq War in living memory. Memories which are, as everyone who will be joining us knows, are still seared in the hearts and minds of so many, and most of all of Iraqis. And it is a history which still unfolds. Ours today will begin largely around the US-led invasion of 2003, which was, as you will all know, a watershed moment for the people of Iraq, for the region, and far beyond. And its repercussions are still very much felt today. And the reason for discussing this today has been prompted by a very powerful, I hope you would agree, 5-part documentary series on BBC Two entitled Once Upon a Time in Iraq. And it has been telling the story of the Iraq War since the 2003 invasion through the reflections, remembrances, and experiences of civilians, of soldiers, and of journalists. And if you haven't seen it yet, I urge you to either watch it on iPlayer, it's there for you to see. And if anyone's joining us from the United States, a shortened version will be playing on PBS in the United States. But it is a reminder, if a reminder was needed, of what are the all too often tragic consequences, but certainly the very powerful consequences in people's lives of political decisions and the ramifications which can continue for generations to come. So today we'd like to look at the issue of the Iraq War as living memory and to explore ideas about how do you compile these sort of narratives decades on, and do these narratives help us to look back and reassess the way we thought about decision making, in this case, in the early part of the Iraq-led invasion of 2003. And can we, and this is a really urgent and important question, can we actually trace a line, a straight line, a direct line between what happened in 2003 to, of course, the rise of the insurgency, and the rise of so-called Islamic State, to where we are today with the protesters on the streets, young, in fact, protesters across Iraqi society complaining about corruption and nepotism, sectarianism, and the many ills which still affect Iraq today. And finally, we would also like to be guided by the question, and this is a question that many of you will have reflected upon in the years since the invasion, is that has the war in Iraq shaped our understanding and our perceptions of foreign invasions and military interventions more broadly? Is Iraq indeed a cautionary tale? We have a great lineup of speakers joining us today, including Jo Abel, who is the series producer for Once Upon a Time in Iraq. She's an award-winning freelance documentary producer. She also worked on the earlier, widely acclaimed series, Exodus, Our Journey Continues. Joining us as well is someone you will have seen in the film. In fact, you may know him from the most popular comedy program in Iraq, Ahmed Al-Bashir, comedian, journalist, and director. His program, Al-Bashir Show, began broadcasting in 2014, and anyone who's had anything to do with Iraq knows that Iraqis have a wicked sense of humor, and Ahmed is proof of that. Also, James Bluebell, who's the series director for Once Upon a Time in Iraq, and he is the co-author of the book which has been released alongside the documentary series with the same, which takes the same name, Once Upon a Time in Iraq. His previous works include The Romanians Are Coming, which was screened on Channel 4, and after that the series which I just mentioned, Exodus, Our Journey to Europe, about, of course, the wave of migration in 2015 and what happened to some of those people, many people who sought refuge in Europe. And that too was an award-winning series. And finally, Dr. Renaud Mansour, who's the Senior Research Fellow for the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, also the project director at Chatham House for the Iraq initiative. And he worked with James on the book Once Upon a Time in Iraq and also advised on the series. He's also been since 2011 a senior research fellow at the Iraq Institute for Strategic Studies in Beirut. And he's not just a thinker, but he's also a doer. He was an advisor for a time to the Kurdistan regional government, the civil society ministry. So welcome to all of you, and welcome to you who join us from wherever you are living or working now. We look forward to your questions as we begin our conversation. Joe, could I first begin with you to decide in a very crowded news landscape, in a very fractured world where people seem to swipe and click and move to the next story before the last story is even finished, the idea for going back and doing this kind of a very, very considered reflection about what happened once upon a time in Iraq?
Well, I mean, the idea came really from James early on after we'd finished Exodus, and I think he will talk more about that and about what motivated him to want to explore this really complicated landscape. I think to make any 5-part series is an ambition, and to find a way to tell the complicated and ongoing tragedy of the Iraq War in 5 hours was a challenge, to say the least. Documentary as a genre has great advantages and definite limitations. Essentially, our remit is to tell stories in a way that engages viewers and enables them to see and hear the experiences of others. And I think that's the difference in what we did, is that we were there to tell people's stories. In Once Upon a Time in Iraq, we assumed, rightly or wrongly, that in the main viewers knew the headlines of this war: weapons of mass destruction, an illegal war, an invasion that would liberate the Iraqi people from a cruel dictatorship. All those headlines that were told to us over and over again. And I think it's important to understand that we're not experts on Iraq, but our job was to find a way to tell some of the stories from this war. And I think documentary as a genre differs to other types of programs that have approached this subject over the last 17 years. Everyone wants to make a brilliant film, and to do that you have to find the best cast, and this requires huge effort from the team. And in this case, which was identifies the series particularly, is the sort of tireless detective work of the archive producer to find the footage to bring the interviews to life. 2 key starting points and good illustrations, I think, of how we built the series was firstly with Dexter Filkins and his extraordinary account in The Forever War of his years covering Iraq for the New York Times. He was able to revisit his experiences and help us understand some of the realities and legacy of this war whilst providing some context. Similarly, when we found Waleed and discovered he was the lead singer of a heavy metal band in Saddam's Iraq, we had no idea that there were hours of footage of him as an 18-year-old. And Miriam Walsh, our amazing archive producer once again, tracked down the filmmaker who had followed Waleed in 2003 and 2004. And this meant that his memories and experiences could be brought to life through both interview and image. And I think, in a way, is the key to part of what has made the series so successful. Essentially, that was how we built the series, with a cast of interviewees who were able to return to their terrible times and share their stories. We were trying to cover 17 years of a complicated and divisive situation. You can't hope to tell a whole story, and had we tried to do that, we wouldn't have had room for the stories we did tell. You have to make decisions that inevitably miss out great swathes of context. So, for example, it was pretty clear early on that we had already heard a lot from the politicians and not the people, and it was their stories that needed to be told. I think it's true to say that you can never expect to include everything you discover, or all the footage you film, or the testimonies you record, but you aim to weave stories you're told with events that contextualise them, and in doing so create a series that draws people in. And, you know, I hope that's what we've done, and it's how we have differed from other programs that have been made on the Iraq War.
It's very, I'm torn between whether I should assume everyone has seen it or whether I should give everything away, but it's very raw, as you know, and you use some techniques which aren't often used in documentary making. You know, the outtakes, the things you cut out, people who are smoking, people who are drinking tequila, very awkward, very personal moments. A number of the people you interviewed said it was the first time since the invasion of 2003, or since this battle, or since something very traumatizing, that they have thought of it. So we felt that, I mean, there was one review said even it was like a therapy session. Was this discussed about how raw it should be? I mean, obviously it's powerful because we really feel the intensity of the emotion, but as filmmakers,
I think that it's very much in the a model of how James, and it was James who did the majority of the interviews, of how he engages with people. And I think that people felt both fear but relief at having the opportunity to talk about it. So everybody was damaged by this war that we spoke to, whether they were Iraqi or American, in fact. But taking the approach of trying to understand their personal stories allows them to explore things that perhaps they wouldn't have done. I think, you know, James is probably a better place to talk about this part of it than me in lots of ways, but we weren't setting out to trip anybody up, we didn't have an agenda. We didn't have a hypothesis that we were working from. We wanted to hear what it was like at the time when they were there, and what the legacy of that war was for all those people. And I think there's a simplicity in that clears a very, very complicated landscape that we didn't have the time, nor were we equipped to be able to tell that complexity. And in the same way that Exodus was raw and it was revealing and people were telling stories that were very difficult for them to tell, I think the same is true of the people that we've spoken to in the series.
Ahmed, let me bring you in here. Let's go back to the beginnings, once upon a time. When you first got the call or the email to ask you whether you'd like to go back over all your memories of this period, which, as we see in the film, it had highs and lows for you. What was your first thought?
Well, first of all, I just want to say something. I never knew that tequila was allowed during shooting this film. So that's something you, James, be responsible for that.
Not whiskey, not rye, but only tequila,
Whatever it is. Second of all, actually, the story of mine, I don't want to go back to it because that story wasn't so good. It wasn't the kind of stories that someone tells it to the friend with a pride. With a happy face, because there's a lot of bad moments, sad moments in it. There's lots of sorrow. There is a lot of memories that I don't want to go back to it again. But since once I talked about my story in a TEDx theater in Baghdad, and it helped me a lot getting over some things. But after this documentary, and they went through all the feelings, all the emotions, and the questions was very, you'll see it as a simple question, but at the same time, it was a relieving question for me. As you said, it's almost a therapy session. It's not just an interview. I figured it out that there's lots of things were very bad to me, and I need to get rid of it. And after this interview, I did, and it helped me. But still, until this moment, I didn't watch the whole movie. I watched only the half of it. I don't want to go back to these moments again, because in Iraq, we do this. We have a sad moments almost every day. There is a sad story in almost every house in Iraq because of sectarianism, because of 1980 war, because of sanctions, because of the regime after 2003, the whole thing. I mean, the bombs, the terrorism, the militias, all of these. So I'm sure every Iraqi house has their own sorrow or own, let's say, problem or big problem. So we don't want to go there. We don't want to go back. We don't want to watch because we want to look to the future. I was talking to my friend like 5 minutes ago, and she said that 5 minutes before we start this session, and she said, I want a happy ending for Iraq. And this is what we all want, a Hollywood ending for the Iraqis. And I hope it's later on, we remember these moments as just the sad moments that we lived through until we go to this good moments that we're living in. But in this time now, I don't think so it's possible.
Even if, I mean, of course, I should mention, and I'll take up some of these questions with James, is that with a film like this, where there are Iraqis, of course, who I think are the most important players of all, because it's your country, your future, your present. But of course, it involved Americans, it involved people from other nationalities. And I suppose everyone will have their own sense of when it is time to go back and revisit what happened in those seminal events. But even if, Ahmed, you say perhaps you're looking to a better future and your eyes have to be kept forward, can I just ask you whether you see what is unfolding in Iraq now does it trace back for you to that watershed moment of 2003? Is that for you the turning point?
Oh yeah, definitely, 100%. It's all linked to 2003 moments, because we didn't take down Saddam as we're supposed to do. We should remove him ourselves, the Iraqis, without the interference of superpower. This is how they removed Hosni Mubarak. This is how they, lots of presidents. I know it wasn't perfect after them, but in the same time, we should earn our democracy. We shouldn't get our democracy from outside. And yes, definitely, it's all linked to 2003 moments. It's all linked to the bad decisions that been taken by the Iraqis and the Americans and the Brits and mostly the whole world. It's all connected to the decision when Bush took that decision to invade Iraq. Everything is connected: militias, corruption, outside interference, the immigrants, the Iraqi immigrants, democracy, sectarianism. It's all connected to that moment.
And what this 5-part documentary tells us is a story, and Iraqis don't need a documentary to tell them, but it's a descent into something ever darker. You, in at least part of your life, are dealing with it through comedy. Does that help you and help Iraqis to deal with these dark forces that are now part of the Iraqi landscape?
We Iraqis, just like we're very similar to the Egyptians. We always make fun of our problems to get over it, because trust me, if you are an Iraqi person and you've been dealing with all these problems, it will be impossible to get over one bad thing that you've been through. And I know every Iraqi has more than 200 bad things have been through in his entire life. It's not a bad thing about losing job or maybe getting a better job or a promotion. No, it's a bad thing where you lose your loved ones by killers, where you leave your house, where you lose your job because of sectarianism, or lose your future because of sectarianism, and so on, so on. So, yeah, I don't know. I was talking about, I forgot.
No, that's okay. We understand. It's very interesting culturally that in English we often say the safety valve, that you deal with it through comedy.
Oh, yes. So
yeah.
comedy, we use comedy as a hope, some kind of hope. And in Iraq, we literally, our hope is, the hope for us is like, we're addicted to hope. So whenever we see a window with a light open, we run to it because we believe this is the solution. This is the time for the new solution. This is the happy end that we are looking for, everyone. So comedy is one of these things. Actually, Iraqis could get over sectarianism, the sectarianism war in 2007 by using, of course, with other solutions, but one of main solutions were joking about sectarianism in 2006 and 7. They were making fun of themselves, killing each other. They were making fun of militias and Al-Qaeda and terrorists and the other Sunni militias. and they were making fun of everything. This is how they could get over it. So making fun of things, comedy really helps Iraqis.
Well, I hope if there's any documentary producers listening to this webinar, that they will give you the starring role in that Hollywood film that Iraq certainly deserves to see one day. So hold on to that hair. Let's bring you in here to discuss about, Joe gave us a little bit of the backstory, if you like, to putting this, this very ambitious documentary together. Let me begin by asking you, and obviously, when you put something like this together, you're thinking about who's going to watch it. Which audience did you have in mind when you were thinking about this documentary? Was it for maybe many audiences, but who did you want this to reach?
We made it for the BBC, and our primary audience is British, and I guess by extension Western. It's made for a Western audience to understand the impact the decision to invade Iraq had on Iraqis.
So then I must, perhaps it'll run on PBS, and perhaps it will also run on BBC World TV, which will give it a broader, I'm sure it will have an international viewing as well at some point. But if so, then I will ask the question that was asked in one of the reviews of why then not include the British part in this, in these sequence of events. Some would say they played the enabling role to allow the invasion to go ahead, even though they weren't the main actor.
Well, they certainly legitimized it, I think, that's for sure. And it meant that they could say the word coalition, which was very useful for the Americans. I interviewed lots of British people. I interviewed lots of British soldiers, and the good thing about having the book is they're in the book. It's not completely wasted. The book is much longer than a 5-part series, and the series, in a filmmaking sort of terms, the series needs to be propelled by a narrative, and that narrative, film 1 has to get to Baghdad. Who takes you to Baghdad? The British don't, the Americans do. And once you're on that narrative, it was always that the British were always sort of doing everything second. They were never at the top of that spear. They were never really pushing events. And then they disappear. So they just sort of fell out. There wasn't enough sort of room to get them in the 5-part series. And in that sense, what I'm hoping for British and a Western audience is that the Western army, the American army that you see, and the American politicians and Tony Blair that you see in the archive, that represents our involvement as well. They stand for the coalition.
Is it possible for you to explain what your ambition was for this series? Some people have said, well, it gives voice to Iraqis whose voices haven't always been the main players in previous Iraqi documentaries. Was it some people say that it went away from a more myopic, to use the word used in one review, view of the world. What was your ambition? What would the signature you wanted to have through this documentary?
I wanted people to feel it. I wanted people to feel empathy, and people feel empathy not with a topic or with an event. They feel empathy with other people. So it was really important to make that connection, and that's why we included those moments that lots of other people might not include, those off camera moments. I mean, they were on camera because you could include them, but those moments which sort of take you in and sort of make you understand that person a little bit better. And it's all about building bridges, I think. And that was the most important thing I wanted this film to do. It was to create empathy.
It's hard for Iraqis to watch, as we heard from Ahmed, and some Iraqis may feel it's too early to go back over it, but it's also hard for Americans to watch because of that sense of responsibility that comes through so clearly in the film, and it's voiced by the American soldiers who seem still damaged by what has happened. So have you had any reaction from people who've been involved in the war to say either don't blame everything on us, or to say you're right, we do bear responsibility even for the rise of Islamic State? I
mean, I had reaction at the time from when I was interviewing, which was which was that they could draw a line between their involvement and, you know, the formation of ISIS. I don't think they felt like they were personally sort of responsible because of this thing that you take orders. But, you know, when you look back on your life, are you proud of that thing that you did in that country? No, I don't think many of them are really proud of that thing that they did in that country. And then just after the broadcast, I haven't heard much, you know, but you get the sort of like the occasional sort of communication from soldiers saying that it was accurate. What was shown was what it was like. And Walid, who's not on this webinar, he got contacted by a soldier that had seen the PBS version. And the soldier said, like, I was in Iraq, I was in your country, I did all this, and I just, you know, I'm in Toronto often. It would be great to sort of meet up and just try and make sense of this stuff. So people, I think, on both sides of the coin, Iraqis and Americans and British have been affected by this.
And are you hoping there will be lessons learned in this? Because, of course, the Middle East now continues to be riven by, to use Dexter Filkins' term, forever wars, with discussion of who should intervene, although now it's mostly regional players who are intervening with either a nudge and a wink from Washington or London, or sometimes more active support from Paris or one other European capital. I think
there's lessons obviously need to be learned. I mean, for the film, the very clear message is anti-war. You know, don't rush into something you don't understand. But I also think that, particularly for a Western audience, a lot of this stuff, which feels like it should be very well known, just isn't very well known. It's been conveniently forgotten about, and it's reminding people that actions have consequences. And the world that we live in today, you know, is formed with a big sort of set of context which goes back to 2003. And so before you start to blame refugees for coming over to Europe, you've got to understand the wider context of why this is happening.
It's always tough, as you know, we'll know very well, in this kind of a documentary we were discussing before the webinar started, where you have a review coming from the Arab world, from an Iraqi, to say, oh, we've heard this all before, oh, we know already of these personalities, and then you get from a more mainstream newspaper in the United Kingdom saying, wow, impressive array of voices, haven't heard or seen this before. And it's always difficult, isn't it, to strike the right balance between those who know so much, too much, they believe, and those who are coming to it to the first time. And for them, it's something completely new and jarring, of course.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess you make these things to communicate to as many people as possible. You can't just sort of ignore. Yeah. I mean, I think the observation was that we had chosen people that were already quite well known in Iraq, and yeah, that might be so. I mean, I found them on, you know, a lot of it on the internet. So, but it's not very well known outside of Iraq, and that's you know, that's important to remember, that this was made for an audience, a Western audience. It's not really. It's not like it's not made for an Iraqi audience, but the Iraqis are going to have so much more understanding and context that it would require, in order to sort of convey that, it would require something even bigger than, you know, the Vietnam series that PBS did. It would be huge, and you can't do it.
Well, let's bring in Reynad here, of course, who straddles both worlds, you know, very much, who watches every twist and turn in Iraq, knows it forensically, but also based at Chatham House in London, and also with one of the authors of the other co-author of the book with James. What for you is the important value of going back in this way and giving these very, very raw personal narratives of what happened over these more than a decade in Iraq?
Yeah, I think that balance, certainly James and I and Joe, we had big discussions back and forth, because in my day job, as well as, you know, in my social science training, you bring academics and experts to discuss issues of history, those who have gone through the archives and have done all the work already, to then discuss some kind of historiography based on all of their PhDs. And James was having none of that. I remember I was in Baghdad and I was going around Iraqis asking who can be part of this film. And I was like, James, I have this expert, I have this, this and that. And he was like, we want the voice of Iraqis. We want that voice that's not an expert analyst. But more importantly, I think I wanted to note that James interviewed very senior American, British, and Iraqi officials. Bremer was interviewed for 2 days for this, but did not make the cut. Why? Because at the end of the day, and I think James should actually talk about this because he has a good explanation for this, they've already had their voice. Everybody knows the narratives. Everybody knows how the neoconservatives in the Bush administration will defend this, or how the administration in London will defend it, or even how the Iraqis, many of them foreign Iraqis, who came to Baghdad after 2003 and became multimillionaires, they continue to have a voice. The only voices that have been missing are the voices of those people who didn't have that opportunity. And they're making their own voice now. I think the October 29 protests, moving onwards, is the first real challenge, the first real attempt for many Iraqis to say, this is what we want, and enough is enough. And I think what James is doing is part of that, in a way, to give a voice to those who don't have a voice because they face a structure that is not looking out for many Iraqis.
So as someone who knows Iraq so well, in the 5 documentaries that have gone to air, and indeed in the book that you co-authored, what surprised you? Did anything surprise you, change your view, give you a new insight?
Well, certainly the biggest learning experience was just how documentary filmmakers, how they're very cool in the way that they're able to make a compelling argument through storytelling. So I think in terms of methodologies, that was better than my kind of, this is my thesis, these are my arguments, and this is my proof to make my point. I mean, that was a big learning phase. But also, going through the narratives, when you speak to people like Ahmed and others, although again, for me, I know where they're coming from. But are we listening? Are we going back? Are we revisiting history? I mean, there was a lot. I mean, this is really one of the first times where we're looking at Iraq not as current affairs, but as a history, where we're using archives, where we're reflecting back. And are those narratives, are Iraqis sectarian? At some point, there's a big discussion in the series about this. Is it that, for example, the regime before 2003 had a lid on everything? And as soon as you remove the lid, all of these sectarian Iraqis sort of burst up and they go to those subnational elements? Or is it that, and this links to your question on sort of the legacies, was it a political system that was put there that said you had to have this many Shia, this many Sunnis, this many Christians, Kurds, and this was also very mainstream at the time, right? So Joe Biden, for example, made a map I think it was New York Times, where he said Sunnistan, Shiistan, and Kurdistan. That today, all of those arguments being made then, you won't feel is true today. Iraqis are rejecting many of those things that the Americans and the foreign Iraqi leaders tried to give to them under the guise of democracy.
Yes, I mean, many at the time, as you know, when Bremer was helping to put together the first governments, it was that system you just described. And so many Iraqis accuse the Americans, and that certainly comes out in the documentary, of fomenting, some even say creating sectarianism in Iraq. And for you, I mean, obviously documentary has to have a strong arc. For an academic, you'll have lots of footnotes and if, but, and, or. You're comfortable with the arc because you're left with an inviting impression that were it not for the US-led invasion, or that everything can be traced back to the US-led invasion of 2003.
Yeah, I mean, even working at a think tank like Chatham House, I mean, oftentimes what I write for a more mainstream audience, and there are compromises you have to make. There are certain words that you have to use, buzzwords and all of this. It's just part of the system to try and make a change in a different way. And I think the point of this isn't to teach Iraqis what's happened, but that the whole world outside, particularly the Western world, should know. Because, you say that there aren't any more attacks, but let's keep in mind that Iraq is still being attacked. Iran is active military in Iraq. The US is still attacking Iraq, including earlier this year when they killed the Iranian general as well as militia leaders. So the story isn't over yet. And I think that's what's important here. Although we're looking back at history, we're trying to learn. How many times have you heard mission accomplished, right? I mean, it was 6 weeks after the invasion, that the first time it was announced. Every single US president has announced in different ways some kind of mission accomplished in Iraq. And yet we're still there, beginning in 2020 now. People talk about ISIS maybe coming back, protesters who are being killed. Conflict is not over. So this is still very much a living conflict.
I want to move on to contemporary events in just a moment, but let me just ask you one last question, since we're now seeing Ahmed again in vision. Ahmed said, our story's not finished yet, and we'd prefer to advance more and hopefully in a positive direction. We don't want to look back. And he may reflect the views of a lot of Iraqis. What would you say, as someone who's lived with this for so long? Is there a value in going back? Like, for example, the situations are very difficult, but different. But I see in Afghanistan now, young Afghans are going back over their history because they say we want to avoid the mistakes. So a lot of them are thinking about asking these questions and saying it's so important to interrogate history. What would you say, Reynat?
Well, keep in mind that about 60% of Iraq's population is under 25. They don't remember much of the invasion, certainly they don't remember before 2003. So they've kind of grown up in this hell, right? However, what I find remarkable about Iraqis, and it really struck me once when I was driving, leaving Mosul, I think it was last year, and I was with a foreign academic who works on Iraq, and I was with an Iraqi academic, and we had just given a sort of a panel at the University of Mosul talking about the state and all of these issues. And, the Iraqi academic goes to the foreign academic and he says, you're allowed to be that critical. You're allowed to have no hope, right? And so your analysis is very negative and critical, rightfully so. But us as Iraqis who live here, if we had no hope, if we didn't go back and try and romanticize some kind of elements of our history, and also, how would we see a future? I mean, that's suicide if you have no more hope in living. And so most Iraqis, I know, like, for example, and I wanted to mention this, a friend of ours was assassinated a few weeks ago, Hisham al-Hashimi, right? And many people knew about this assassination. I was speaking to Hisham a few months ago, and he was hopeful about this new prime minister. I won't go into current affairs, but it makes my point, that this is someone who lived through sanctions, right? Went to jail several times in his life, was part of an Islamic resistance campaign, felt violence, had family members killed, and yet in 2020, after decades of being pounded and pounded, had hope that this new prime minister might be the best chance. So I think that hope that Ahmed talks about, and that going towards a kind of Hollywood ending, still lives in every Iraqi who lives there because they need it.
Well, all of us who cannot begin to stand here to salute this hope and share your hope, and hope against hope, as we say, that it will take a turn, because as Ahmed said, the story is not over. Let's move it now to look a little bit. Cameron, I'll ask one question to you, Red, and then I'll come back to you, Ahmed. Many of you will have read or should read the article by Robert Worth in New York Times Magazine called The Iraqi Kleptocracy, who talks about the existential crisis now facing Iraq. But there's one phrase that I noticed, which he said, the Americans now have a moment, they could seize this moment to undo the damage, the kind of damage that is discussed in this documentary series, Once Upon a Time in Iraq, that if they do something to crack down on the corruption in which they play a role in the oil sales, but also in backing the protesters that Ahmed was talking about, who right across Iraqi society, whatever their sect, whatever their background, whatever their class, are all calling for the same kind of one nation, new nation. Is there a chance, Reynat, for America to undo the damage, to use Robert's phrase?
Well, I mean, if you ask the academic, does international state building work? In most cases, the answer is no, particularly when the US try and build states abroad. And so it's a structural problem, right? I speak to many American officials across the government who all genuinely, they want to fix Iraq in different ways. But this is a structural problem where at the top, there's a system, and that system leads to inefficiencies, incompetencies, and also more malign sort of processes. And you see in the article, the Americans went into 2003 without a strategic foresight, without any understanding. They bring in this young man who's going to be the king of Iraq for a year, who didn't speak the language. I mean, it's all a farce. If you would tell someone who had no idea what the Americans did in 2003, 2005, how many billions of dollars, were unaccounted for, and they wouldn't believe it. You can't make this stuff up. right? So I think to now then go to America today and expect that America interfering to help civil society, I think many Arabs across the Middle East will give you their concerns about this. Of course, Ahmed will have other ideas, but in any case, America could have a role in capacity building, in helping, develop, in education, but these are long-term things. America has tried often to use military solutions to fix Iraq. If they remove the military solutions to try and fix the political problems by helping to build the new generation, by investing in things like education from the beginning, by investing in social services and healthcare, that might be a chance. But America will not fix Iraq as long as it continues to use Iraq as a pawn or a playground for its regional disputes with Iran and other issues. So it's that political element that often seeps into America's state building in Iraq that makes it difficult for America really to have a coherent policy in Iraq.
Ahmed, what do you think? To use the phrase that Robert Worth used, saying that the United States gives $10 billion in cash, cold cash, to Iraq for oil sales, and that helps to feed this corruption that now seems to permeate many sectors of Iraqi society. Do you think the United States, the West more generally, should be helping to do something to put it right?
I guess this is what we were discussing all the time. Is it the responsibility of the US or the world to take actions in Iraq and to solve the problems that they created or they helped in a way to create it, or they made it without knowing the society of Iraq by the mistakes that they've done before? Well, if you talk to any Iraqi, you would say yes. Lots of Iraqis, I would say yes. America. Some people in Iraq believes that America will invade Iraq again and take down this whole system down and make new elections and make people choose again their representatives again. Some of the Iraqis really believes that this is the solution. I don't believe this is the solution by invading again, because the invasion will create more problems, of course, and military but the problem is, okay, I agree with what Rinat said. There is not only, not using the military action in Iraq to solve the problems, but at the same time we have a weak government. This government cannot face the militias alone. The militias are killing and kidnapping Iraqis, and they're stealing their money, and they're building their institutions, and they're generating money by owning and put their hands on big institutions, economic institutions in Iraq, and media, and they control mostly the whole country. How should we, or could we, get rid of these corrupt politicians and militias and armed groups? I don't know how he's going to do it. It's not my job to do it. My job is to make fun of these things only. But I believe that this is the world responsibility. USA, UK, the coalition, the whole coalition, who started the war in 2003. This is their responsibility to solve the problem that they created. And I repeat the same thing that everyone, maybe Rinat also agrees with me, that withdrawal from Iraq was a bigger mistake than invading Iraq in 2003, because withdrawal was a disaster and it led to ISIS, and Noor al-Maliki did what he is not supposed to do. So yes, the world should take a big role in Iraq.
That I think was, but I think the withdrawal decision, I was with Admiral Mullen when he made his last trip to Iraq, 54 degrees that day. We went to Mosul and to Baghdad, and it was his last attempt to try to persuade the Iraqis to keep some soldiers. And he came and he said, no, the Iraqis want us, all the troops to leave. I mean, some of the decision-making, of course, has to be brought to the door of Iraqi leaders as well. Of course, they were leaders like Maliki, and the documentary says, who were kept there by support, by the West's support as well.
Yeah, the fun thing in that matter, it's very funny, because let's say the majority of Iraqis asked, I would say, if we take divisions, I hate to say these words that I'm gonna say now, but if we say that The Shia politicians brought the Americans to the country to get rid of Saddam. And the Sunnis, the Sunni politicians and the Sunnis fought the Americans to get them out of Iraq. But then, now, that was in 2003. 2020, the Sunnis are demanding the Americans to stay in Iraq, and they're going to protect them. And the Shia politicians want the Americans to leave Iraq. So that's why it's very complicated in Iraq. You never know what's going to happen tomorrow and how people will change sides. I never expected one day that Anbar, Salahuddin, Nainawa, Diyala, these provinces would ever, you see a soldier, American soldier, walking in the streets and everyone supporting him and believes that he can protect them. But now you can see that clearly in many provinces in Iraq. Maybe you don't see American soldiers on the streets, but you see the people are supporting the American troops to stay. So it's complicated, but in the same time, it wasn't the Iraqi decision purely on 2011, the withdrawal. It wasn't purely Iraqi decision. It was Iranian decision. And the Iran could control Iraqi politicians and could manage to make them getting the Americans out. And of course, it was Obama's mistake also.
We do need to discuss the regional players because Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. But let me just bring in a question first, which will bring in Joe and James, that questions to the filmmakers. How interested were broadcasters in revisiting the 2003 invasion? James, you mentioned that you did it for the BBC. Did you approach the BBC, or the BBC said, let's go back to it? Did you sense there was a great interest in doing, doing 5 is a lot.
I didn't, no, it was having made Exodus, and it was sort of wanting to understand how we got here. That's what I took to the BBC, using the same grammar that we had sort of done in Exodus, but exploring this historical narrative, this past tense narrative. And I don't think there was many other takers for that film. I don't think Netflix were going to be knocking at my door, or Amazon Prime, or anyone else. It was the BBC that sort of recognised the importance of it and said, "Yeah, go for it." And
is it? It's probably too early to say, because of obviously a lot of people watch on iPlayer now, so it's probably too early to say. And as we say in filmmaking, some of these series have a long tail, so people may come to it later once there's a buzz on social media about it, people are discussing it. But either Joe or James, your sense that having chosen that, obviously your ambition must have been in choosing to look at such a complicated political story, complicated history, and it gets more complicated by the year, but in choosing to do it through personal, very human stories that you could draw people in. And are you feeling now that you were able to achieve that, Joe?
Yeah, I think we did it. We have achieved that. And I think it's been both extraordinary and surprising, because there wasn't a lot of interest. You're always trying to raise more money for a series that is as big and as expensive as this. And there was very little enthusiasm for it until sort of much later on. So it was something that the BBC could support and was a really good platform for us to work from. And I think, well, I hope that, it will sell in lots of other regions and raise a sort of consciousness about the legacy and the ongoing and current tragedies that are being played out in Iraq specifically.
Because one of the questions, sort of an additional question, was that has the world lost interest in Iraq beyond seeing it only through the lens of mistakes made by the US and Britain?
Well, it's difficult to answer that, isn't it? I think there was a sort of, there was a sort of fear that there was an ennui with, that we'd be met with disinterest. And I think that we knew that we'd made a good series, but we didn't expect it to resonate in the way that it has, and that the use of the human stories and allowing a Western audience to understand the way that this destroyed personal lives that are just like theirs, because that in a way is what has been missing. You know, when you watch in episode 1 the Shock and Awe campaign, and I remember that at the time, and it was like a fireworks show. You didn't understand that, you know, Waleed was out on his bicycle getting cigarettes, that Sally Mars's mother threw herself on top of her children. You know, in the West we sit so comfortably, and we don't really understand what the reality of these decisions are on the people living in those places. And I hope it shocks people. I hope it helps people empathise. And it's you know, it's, I think, a better thing that it has been responded to in the way that it has.
Reynad, if the BBC came to you and said, what do you think we should do for our next documentary on Iraq? What story would you want to tell that should be told now?
I think, so this documentary obviously has been shot in the last few years. I think what happened in October 2019 onward is a big challenge to the Iraqi state. I think the protesters, but also the decision by Iraq's so-called democratic leaders who came in to free Iraqis from dictatorship, their decision as a collective to justify violence, to use violence, or to not speak out against violence in a way to put to quit. And they're all complicit in this system. And you know, Iraq, I mean, I don't know how many, I know there are some countries, but Iraqis have been protesting a lot. It's continuing protests. And yes, Corona has stopped it, but I think Iraq would be up there in terms of countries in the world where you have a continued protest movement. And these are all kids. And I think their story, they make me feel, I never felt old until I went to Tahrir and started hanging out with some of these protesters, and they were showing me on their phones all of these things, TikTok and all that stuff. I think that's a story that's ongoing. And really, it's so, just to see it, you know, we write about this. Ahmed has done wonders to not just bring comedy into it, but also information, right, into how rotten the system is. For these protesters to then go out knowing that they're going to get shot at and to stay there in the squares, to me, is a story that's in the making.
I have to say the stories that came from the square were absolutely inspiring, both for the unity among the protesters, trying to shatter some of the fault lines that, you know, we talk about often in the news. But also, as you said, even when the security forces opened fire, and sometimes shadowy security forces, they still went out. And I think it is a great pity that because the news landscape is dominated by what's happening in President Trump's America, and of course now lately the COVID-19, well, of necessity, the world has to focus on COVID-19, but the Iraqi stories don't get this kind of attention that they have in the past. Ahmed, if you, aside from your Hollywood blockbuster happy ending, what would be the story that you would want to tell about Iraq now?
Okay, I agree. I agree with Reynad. Definitely, 2019 needs a documentary, because the soul of the Iraqis, the things that we've seen, we never expected to see in our lives. Not even in movies, not even in our dreams. The courage, everything connected to each other. When you see someone, that's why sometimes I say to my friends that I see them as an angels, that they can't do mistakes, and they keep saying, you're exaggerating. Don't do that to them, because they could make mistakes, and I know they're right. But sometimes I really, the hope that they gave me, and they gave the whole Iraqis, you can't imagine the number of Iraqis who were texting me and writing to me on 2019 protests, who were living outside, and they have citizenships, and they're stable in their countries. And they were saying that, do you think this is the moment where we're gonna go back to Iraq and rebuild it again? Do you think this is the moment? So I think more than 5 million Iraqis outside of Iraq are waiting for this moment to go back home, to rebuild their country. And I know many people, they lost hope in Iraq. They never see Iraq in the news. After the protest, they went back again to maybe
to fix the Iraqi situation. So yes, I believe 2019 protest is something needs to be focused on.
We had a question from Mohammed Adnan, who said, what role can Iraqi protesters play in the future of Iraq? And as you know, one of the questions which came up in the so-called Arab Spring when young generations took to Tahrir Square in Cairo, now the question is being asked again about leadership. And the answer sometimes comes, well, no, we don't want to choose leaders yet because they'll get compromised by the system. I mean, how will the Iraqi protesters, you know, the big mass of Iraqi protesters, how will they play a role beyond, of course, these very important protests that you and Reynad both emphasized or both highlighted?
This is what exactly the US government and the world and the Iraqi government, I mean, Mustafa al-Kadhimi's government should do, is to protect Iraqis, the demonstrators, to form their parties, and then they go to the parliament. And I'm sure they will get lots of votes, a lot of votes, because lots of people who don't participate in the elections because they believe this is the same politicians that they are recycling again and go and come back again. And by the way, this is the mistake of the US government. You'll ask me how, because America just brought democracy to Iraq, and it's not their fault. In 2010 elections, when Ayad Allawi and Qaim al-Iraqiyya won the election, the constitution says that the bigger bloc should form the government. America and Iran agreed to repost Nour al-Maliki again as a prime minister. And this is when Iraqis started to lose their faith in democracy, and they started to believe that whatever we've done, whatever we're gonna do, it's gonna be the decision of the Iranians and the Americans. It's not our decision. So now we're not gonna be part of the elections. This is why you see the race of participation in the elections from 2010 to 2018, which lots of sources says it's less than 20%. It's going down because people lost their faith in the election process. So I think this is what the Iraq government should do, and this is what the world should do. Support the demonstrators to form parties and to go to elections, and they will control the parliament and they will form the new government if they had the chance and the security, and there's no arms and by militias used against them.
Reynad, what Ahmed has mentioned twice, Iran, and you know it's often been said the biggest victor in the invasion of 2003 was Iran, that it created a bigger space for Iran, and we're seeing this played out most recently, of course, in what happened with the killing of Qasem Soleimani in Iraq. We're reminded again about all the militias, of course, backed by one side or the other. And it's not just Iran. Turkey, of course, is involved in Iraq. Saudi Arabia has been trying to get involved in Iraq again. How consequential is this battleground between the different regional interests? We see it playing out in Libya. We saw it, of course, with devastating consequences in Syria. How is it going to be managed, if it can be managed, in Iraq going forward?
I mean, very clearly, the story of post-2003 Iraq has been a story of, are you on Team USA or Team Iran? And politicians have had to kind of go between one or the other. Although in recent years, the US has lost a lot of its leverage from the time of when the US withdrew, but also, you know, they don't have the same type of access and power. And in that vacuum, Iran has become quite powerful. Primarily because for Iran, it's an existential crisis, it's on its border, but also Iran has strong relations with many of the Shia parties, but also the Kurdish parties. Keep in mind, Iran has been able to manage a system of working with state institutions, with the president, prime minister, but also with you can call non-state institutions, with different types of armed groups. All of this environment, Iran can kind of ride the wave. So it's not that Iran is all perfect and is all, Iran makes mistakes. 2014, ISIS taking over and coming on its border was a big mistake from Iran, but it's able to manage in a way. It's able to kind of deal with crises and try and manage them. So in that case, whereas the US largely, I would say, has a strategy that, strike a little bit of self-gratification, but then who knows what's going to happen next, and hope somehow that shaking the system, something will come out magically that is what you want it to look like. I think Iran has a far longer, they don't want to just gamble. It's their neighbor, it's their region. They have a far longer reach, and Iraq is very important for Iran because of its regional ambitions. Iraq is a very wealthy country. You talk about the money that has been spent, but the money that has been lost. Keep in mind that that's mainly Iraqi money, right? I mean, it's the oil money, it's the money from Iraq that many of the protesters don't feel. And so this is important to come back to the point of protesters, because all Iraqi leaders, no matter how reformist they claim to be, will still play the game. Mustafa al-Kadhimi as prime minister is still playing that game. He's going to Iran. Protesters are really the only ones who are saying this game isn't helping us and we should change that game. And I think that's why, as Ahmed says, what they've done is very admirable.
James, I'm going to bring you in here now, and this picks up a thread of what Reynad has just been saying. We had a question from John Mason saying, do you think 2003 was a watershed year in the UK and in the United States? Do you see any conflicts since then that are repetitions of this pattern of war? In all those hours you spent with Americans and British, and this you may reflect upon in the book, what lessons did they learn about avoiding this? Were they now looking back to say what we did, what we should or shouldn't have done, and how to avoid it in the future? Is that kind of reckoning going on, aside from you asking them the questions about it?
That kind of reckoning is going on by people that were, victims of the decisions. So the soldiers. I didn't get that sense of that sort of analysis and that sort of personal reevaluating of actions by the decision makers was going on at all. And that's partly why that's a big motivation for why they were cut out of the film. It was massively disappointing.
But you do hear now, after the US-UK invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq, this idea now that these big liberal interventions is a thing of the past. President Trump comes to power saying, I want to end these endless wars. President Obama said it as well, I want to bring the American troops home. There does seem, I think Reynad, I see him nodding a little bit, there does seem to be a realization that they went badly wrong, and partly because they asked the wrong questions and didn't know what they were doing, to pick up what Reynad said earlier about Paul Bremer's rule. You didn't get that sense at all, James, in going through all the going through all the interviews, or Joe's looking a bit cynical there.
I didn't get the sense that the motivation to stop interfering was coming from a particularly noble or good place, of a place of lessons learned and a wiser kind of foreign policy. No, not at all.
Okay. Ahmed, I'm going to bring you back in, because there was a similar question for you. I think people are very excited about your Hollywood film that you're going to be preparing. But we had a question saying, how can we arrive at a Hollywood ending without thoroughly examining our past and seeing how it affected our present narrative? I don't know who asked the question, but the sense that you've got to confront what happened if you have any hope of a better, more Hollywood ending, as you say.
I believe the solution in Iraq is very hard, but in the same time, it's something we can do. A secular government that makes sure that all the Iraqis get their votes and the representatives, of course. And I think the new generation understand that very well, that they need a secular government. They are not going back to the roots, as they say. A sectarianism or choosing representatives by only because he's sharing the group idea with him. And this is the 2019 protests was about. That's why they were saying, the protesters, since 2011, Bism al-Din Bagon al-Harami, in the name of the religion, the thieves stole us. So it started 2011, 2019. People were protesting against militias the same militias 2 years ago. They were saying that we were protecting you against ISIS. So the same people understood that these religious parties and these extreme militia members are not gonna solve the problems, they're gonna make it worse. So secular government, people go to vote, and of course, let's say a transparent elections, where everyone is going to vote and choose, and at the same time they guarantee that their votes are not stolen, just like what's happened in the past elections.
Well, I mean, we all want to believe that is what lies ahead for Iraq, but we also have to be mindful of what some of the threats will be. Renat, I want to bring in on a question. As you know, there's been some comment that in this crisis presented by the coronavirus, that some are trying to benefit from it, including Islamic State. And we had a question saying, is the Iraqi government turmoil likely to lead to the return of ISIS?
Okay, so I can answer a more analytical question now. I'm much
letting you show.
I'm more comfortable with these kind of questions.
You can always tell a few jokes, and you can use your.
No, I think. I think conflict. Look, conflict in Iraq is cyclical, and every few years you have some version of ISIS returning. As I said, ISIS is not a military problem as such. Yes, it's right, as Ahmed says, it requires a military solution, but it also requires a political solution. I remember when I went to Mosul immediately after the liberation, how happy the people of Mosul were to just be out of the Islamic State. You probably remember as well, anyone who's been there at that time would remember that sense of joy. Keep in mind that Ahmed mentioned the 2018 election. Mosul had one of the highest turnouts in the whole country. And also keep in mind that the only incumbent to win was from Mosul, Khalid al-Ubaidi, from the current government, right? So they very much had this sense of hope, just like we've been talking about in this whole panel. You go there now, you speak to them, and they tell you, from the day of liberation till now, we have not seen our government yet. Where is the services? Where is the reconstruction? So although I would say it's a bit difficult that something like the caliphate will return as such, certainly the roots of ISIS, the socio-political and economic roots of ISIS haven't even been touched, not by the Iraqi government, not by the local governments in those areas that fell, or by the international actors who are still playing the same game as 2003 rather than changing it up.
Mm. And I think I should mention too that, one of the highlights of the film was when Omar talked about what he did, the courageous work he did at Mosul I, keeping that hope alive in Mosul during the time of the occupation by Islamic State. And now, anyone who follows him on social media, getting books for the library in Mosul, rebuilding Mosul. And you see that almost day in, day out, that sort of the expressions of hope from him, willing Iraq and his city of Mosul to a different future. And we all do have to hold on to those threads, as small sometimes as they may seem to be. We're coming to but sadly, as always, the questions are starting to come in. I think I'm just going to give you each, if something's been on your mind since we began our conversation, one last thought you'd like us all to leave with, of course, aside from watching the Once Upon a Time in Iraq, which continues on BBC Two Monday. It continues on Monday 9 p.m. on BBC Two, and all the series is online. But Joe, I'll come back to you since you began our webinar, and you've been sitting there like the Sphinx, wisely listening to all of it. A last comment from you.
Well, it has to be that, as Ahmed and Renar talk about, that there is some hope that Iraq can emerge as a society that can care for itself. And I don't know how idealistic it is, but I also hope that we've done a tiny, tiny bit to raise awareness about that. And if we've done that, then that's probably good enough.
And James, I feel I must ask you, having gone through for months upon end, I'm sure all those transcripts, and they must all be in, you've carried them in your head for so long. At the end of it, it left you with some hope, James?
I hope it left me with some hope. I hope. I'm very grateful to everyone that sat on that chair and went through that ordeal. I know for you, Ahmed, it wasn't easy at all. And I hope that sort of dredging up a lot of those memories was maybe personally difficult, but I hope there was a greater good for this film. I hope that's what it's done. A small thing, but something.
Ahmed?
I'm very honored and I'm very proud that I'm in this film, and I've seen some of it, and I'm very happy of the film, and I know it's going to be very important for the audience to understand what's happening in Iraq. I want to thank everyone who worked on that film, and actually we can never thank you enough, because we were always talking about how to get our voice to the outside world to understand what's happening in Iraq. So thank you very much. What you've done is amazing, and I can't express my thanks in words. It's going to be more than that, actually. Thank you very much. And hope is something that we grab on, and this is the only way that it makes us, the only thing that it makes us survive until this moment, just like Renan said. So yes, we will remain grabbing that hope, and one day I'm sure we will get to that Hollywood ending.
And Ahmed, please promise us that when you get around, you find the courage to watch all 5 of the films, whether it's next week, next year, next decade. Drop us a line or tell us on social media what you think of all of them. Let us know whether you thought they were worth doing. And Renan, are you going to throw away that bookcase behind you now, leave your life of the careful academic and become a carefree filmmaker?
Not even close. I think I told James and Joe and Ahmed that I certainly have more cool credibility now that I've been sort of helping on something artistic and in a different way. But I think we all have a role, especially now that, you know, this is a history. And let's go back, revisit history. Those narratives, Iraqis are sectarian, that removing Saddam unleashed sectarianism, or that it was only the Americans. I mean, let's go back and look at what caused where we are today, and try our best, as this film does, to try and guide the way people understand Iraq. As an Iraqi, you know, who travels a lot, you know, if I'm in South America, anywhere, when they say, hey, where are you from? Where are you from? And, you know, if I say Canada, they're like, oh no, but where are you really from? Where are you from? Where are you from? So I say Iraq. And they're like, Iraq, oof, either terroristo or Sunni Shia, or, you know, these are the ways they think of Iraq. And I think it's through this type of medium that reaches far more than the 8 people who read my academic articles.
Well, as you say, we need both. We need the deep dive and the analyses that give us that understanding about that only can be provided by an academic. If it wasn't for your really detailed analytical work, Joe and James wouldn't have been able to rise up from that and to do the kind of personal narratives that were so searing in this documentary. And I think anyone who works on documentaries knows just how much time they take. And so we thank James and Joe and Ahmed and Renan for all the time you took both to do this 5-part series and also to do the accompanying book, which isn't always the case in documentaries. So that will be something else that people can sit down and think even again about what has happened in Iraq. And this phrase of the American writer William Faulkner, who talks about how the past is not yet dead, the past is not even past yet. I think it applies to the situation in Iraq that's unfolding today. And we all look forward to the sequel of the Hollywood ending. And even if it's not Hollywood, even if it's sort of Leicester Square style, we hope that there will be a better ending for Iraq. So thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Chatham House. And thank you to all of you who've joined us today. Do watch the documentary if you haven't already. Do read the book if you haven't already. And just, you know, make sure that you push to have more news about Iraq in our daily news every day. It's really worth listening and watching to. Thank you very much to everyone.